Okay, if we're not stretching time too much, can I ask you to conclude with some considerations about the so-called problem of the instant of change in the Parmenides? Plato makes this interesting and somewhat obscure digression, famous digression, but in simple terms, it seems like the principle he's using, which is rather intuitive and convincing, and he's using the example of change of a state of motion, so something which changes its state of motion from rest to motion. Say, for example, to use an example by Sorabi, a train leaves at noon, right? But the question is, how can it leave at noon? I mean, and Plato's premise seemed to be that it surely, if you ask it, when did it change its state of motion? Well, the answer cannot be while it was still at rest, because of course then change hasn't happened yet, but it can neither be after the change happened, because then the change has happened already, and then of course the question then arise, what is the state of the train at the limiting point? Could you briefly tell us what the options are and how the dialetheist solution is supposed to work in that case?
Okay, so look, the Parmenides first. This has to be the most obscure Platonic dialogue. It falls into two halves, and what the connection is between them is unclear. The first half is relatively straightforward. It's this discussion between Zeno and Socrates, and the problems are understandable. And then you get this sort of segue into page after page after page of deductions carried out by Parmenides himself, if I remember the text. And this stuff about the instant of change occurs at one point in that. Now, what is going on here, scholars really disagree about, and it's very obscure. There's a kind of symmetry in the discussion, because what Plato or Parmenides is doing is considering that what to say about the one under certain circumstances, what to say about the one under other circumstances, what to say about others on one circumstance and another. So there's a kind of symmetry. But then there's this very odd discussion of the instant of change, which gets stuck in only once. And there's a real question about what is going on there. And I don't think we'll help to go into that now. But if you just focus on that little bit of discussion, what Plato seems to suggest is that the instant is an odd thing, that if you consider something changing from being in a certain state to being to a different state, changing at an instant, what state is it in at that instant? And Plato seems to suggest that it's in neither. Okay. So to take an example, let's think of an appropriate example. Well, let me use an example I've used at some other times. Suppose you've got someone who walks out of a room. Okay. So they're in a room, the door's open, they walk through the door. Now there's an instant when they're kind of symmetrically poised between inside and outside. You know, if you like, when their center of gravity is in the same plane as the plane with the center of mass, center of gravity of the door. Okay, so that's kind of symmetrically poised between the person being inside and the person being outside, well, not inside. And the question is, what state are they in at that instant of transition? Are they inside or are they not inside? And Plato's answer is that they're neither. Okay, so what Plato has, or seems to be gesturing at least prima facie, is a theory of truth value gaps. Something can be neither inside nor not inside. And that's certainly one possibility. But if you think about it, there's another possibility as well. What's moving this problem is symmetry. The transition state, whatever it is symmetrically poised between being in and being not in. Okay. Well, if that state is symmetrical, well, there are actually two symmetrical possibilities, namely neither or both. And it looks as though Plato is playing the neither side, but then there's the both side, that's both inside and not inside. Okay, that's the dialectic symmetric possibility. And so again, you've got two possible accounts that you might want to give, and you have to ask which is the preferred one. And you know, there are various arguments pro and con. But let me just give you one, which takes us back to this question of the state of change. As the person walks out the door, they do seem to be in some state of change. Okay. Now, could a gap be a state of change? So suppose, you know, you're in a certain state, and then there's a gap, and then you're in another state. Suppose it's in neither state at the state of change. Could that be a state of change? And the quick answer is no, because a gap does not necessarily betoken a change, because it might be in this state beforehand, then there's this gap, and bugger me if it doesn't stay in the same state. So nothing has changed, right? So there's nothing intrinsic about a gap which betokens a state of change. But there's something intrinsic about a glut, a contradiction, that does. Because, you know, if the state, prior state and the posterior state overlap, even for an instant, then the posterior state has actually been realized, if only for an instant. So, unlike the gap, the posterior state has already started. And therefore, you do have something which intrinsically betokens a change. Okay, that's one consideration. You know, there are things you might say about that, and there are other considerations. But the sort of bottom line is that you've got these two possibilities. They're both symmetric, gaps or gluts, neither true nor false or both true nor false. And then you've got to worry about which of those is more plausible and why.
And why not an asymmetric solution?
Because the problem is essentially one of symmetry. Look, there are certain kinds of change which are clearly asymmetric. So if a car is at rest and starts moving at a certain time, say t equals 0, there is a last motion at which the velocity is 0 and no first motion. So there's a last time at which the velocity is 0 and no first time at which the velocity is non-zero. So that's clearly an asymmetric change. Clearly some changes are asymmetric in that way. So the problem is only going to be posed by changes which are really symmetric. And so you have to focus on apparent cases where you've got symmetry. And one move that you might want to consider is there's no such thing as symmetric change. No, prima facie there are. I gave you one. There are others you might want to consider. But the problem is only going to be posed if and when you've got symmetric changes.
Okay, one last question. The first time that I read you talking about these things, I thought that these problems have to do with vagueness. And then at a second thought, a second reading, you convinced me that they do not. Could you help us dispel this impression that one might have?
Yeah, okay, so this is a natural thought. If I walk out the room, I'm an extended object. And I don't get out the room all at once. You know, sort of my toe of my advanced foot goes out first, and then the rest of the foot, and then my leg, and then, you know, etc. So parts of me, as I go through the room, parts of me are going to be in, parts of me are going to be out. When am I in? When am I out? Well, that's kind of a bit vague. And you might think that, well, this just shows that there's a matter of vagueness. There's a question: how do you deal with these vague issues? Because they are highly problematic. But what's going on here is really a question of how you worry, you theorize vague states, like my being in the room. Okay, I don't think that this problem is a problem of vagueness, simply because, as I said, don't think about me, but think about my center of mass and the plane that runs through the center of mass of the door. Or, you know, if you like, just think about a point particle crossing a boundary, straight line, and it lies on this boundary. Okay, that's obviously symmetrical. It's clearly got nothing to do with vagueness. So whatever is going on here, it's not a problem of vagueness. Now, that's not to say that there aren't real problems about vagueness. Now, this is something we haven't talked about much at all.
Yeah, we can come back to some other time.
But, you know, there are vague transitions. This is the stuff of Sorites paradoxes, you know. So I'm stone cold sober, and I drink 1 cc of alcohol. I'm still stone cold sober. And if I'm sober and I drink 1 cc of alcohol, I'm still sober. But of course, if I drink lots of 1 cc's of alcohol, I'm as drunk as a lord. Okay. This is the Sorites paradox, and this is a problem of vagueness, because being drunk is a vague matter. Okay, so there's a question of how you handle the Sorites paradoxes, and that's another potential application for dialetheism. But obviously, this is not the place to go into that today. We can go into it another time if you want.
Sure.
That explains why. Yeah, that explains at least why this sort of problem of transition is not essentially a problem of vagueness.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you very much, Graham, and talk to you next week.
I look forward to it. Stay safe till then.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Ciao, Graham. Ciao, ciao.